Hello and welcome to Physiology with Shakthi, and today's episode we're going to understand about central pattern generators. Many times we come across a term called respiratory neurons and how they fire. Like the chemoreceptors, the peripheral chemoreceptors, central chemoreceptors, the stretch reflex from the lungs through the vagus, everything seem to act on respiratory neurons, and we usually ended at that. We don't know how it is changing, how it is acting, and in order to understand neural regulation and chemical regulation of respiration in the next two episodes, understanding this basic principle helps you go a long way. So let's start with central pattern generators. So there are different theories that are given when we talk about central pattern generators. So one theory about the pacemaker activity in the respiratory neurons is the restricted site model. So according to the restricted site model, what they say is that there is the pacemaker activity only in one particular area. For example, pre-Bossinger complex has the respiratory neuron pacemaker activity, and it is only in that area that it is present. We got another theory which is distributed model. So according to that, it's similar to how you see in the heart. The pacemakers are present in a lot of places, but one dominant pacemaker takes control over everything else. So that is a distributed model. And then the third model is emergent property model. So that emergent property model, what it mentions is that there are different respiratory neurons which are present, and each contribute in its own way separately and together to finally bring about your respiratory neuron activity, what we call the RAM signal. So that RAM signal is generated by different sets of neurons acting together from different parts. So out of the three, the most widely accepted one is the emergent property model. When we talk about this respiratory neurons discharge or the firing, so because of the firing of these neurons, there's something called a RAM signaling which is present. So this is how it comes. There is initially a slow phase. So it starts over here, and there is a slow period where slowly the neuronal activity is generated and it is maintained for a while like that. This is the potential that we see. So this is coming to minus 60 millivolt, and this is the baseline potential and the resting membrane potential, and from here it goes up and the potential goes up and keeps undulating for a while like this, and at this point it suddenly stops. So when it stops, the fall is much more faster when compared to your rise. So this whole process of it rising takes around 2 seconds. I'm talking about normal process. And then after that, there is a tonical activity present after that. And at that point, this is this point that we saw over here, where the next potential is generated. So this usually amounts to 3 seconds. So you got that right. Inspiration is a shorter process compared to expiration. So the neuronal discharge is such that expiration takes longer time. Now, I don't have to explain why that should happen. You know that inspiration is much faster. When you talk about expiration, the flow rate reduces. Initially there's a peak, after which the flow rate reduces. So it keeps prolonged for a little more while. So that takes place for 3 seconds and inspiration takes place for 2 seconds. So even outward, when the process of inspiration and expiration happens, you can very well see that inspiration and expiration, in expiration is much more slower process and it takes more time than inspiration actually. So that is about your RAM signal. So this signal what you see, that is called the RAM signal. This is the ramping. So it goes up and it ramps over here and it comes down. What is the importance of this ramping? This ramping, this gradual rise and ramping, make sure that inspiration is a gradual process that completely fills up the lung. The more this is prolonged, more ramping is prolonged, more respiratory neurons are acting, and more inspiration happens. So depth of respiration increases when this increases. Okay, so this is said to be controlled by different set of neurons. So I had mentioned the emergent property model. So according to that, there is one first type which acts over here, which results in this activity, and then there's a second type which acts over here, followed by a third type which acts here, the late phase. So that is inspiration, and then after that we got the expiration. So this is fourth type. Over here you see the fifth type and the sixth type. So total of 6 different types of neurons act together to produce this. So how do you see it? We got a set of neurons here. This is the 1 and 2 and 3. So these set of neurons are there. So they together, this is the main one, and they together act, these modulate also, and that results in inspiration. And a set of other neurons which are present. So these also now act and results in expiration, and this also modulates it. So this is how inspiratory and expiratory signals are generated actually. So this is the ramp signal that we are talking about, and we got to know how that is actually happening. So now that this is clear, the next thing we need to understand is, because of this ramping, what actually happens. We'll take a look at the respiratory muscles and how this ramping actually results in a change over there. So over here I'll denote these neurons that we had seen. So the first neuron, that neuron is called the inspiratory. So early inspiratory neuron. So 1 is the early inspiratory neuron. Inspiratory. The 2 is called, this is the most important one, inspiratory augmenting type. Augmenting, so it is often called YAG. So that is inspiratory augmenting. Then third one is this is early inspiratory augmenting. So this would be the late inspiratory. So that is late inspiratory. Fourth one is expiratory decrementing. So expiratory decrementing, and next one, this is the important one with respect to expiration. So that is expiratory augmenting. And the final one over here is the late expiratory or pre-inspiratory, just before inspiration. So late expiratory or pre-inspiratory. These are the different groups of neurons that are there. So first one is the early inspiratory, followed by the inspiratory augmenting, and then the late inspiratory, then expiratory decrementing, followed by expiratory augmenting, and a late expiratory or pre-inspiratory. So you don't need to by heart the names, it just comes. So I'll represent them and the neuronal activity correspondingly over here. So 1, 2. Let's take a look at what happens. So initially when inspiration happens, initial phase of inspiration, this early inspiratory starts acting. So their activity is more profound initially. There, this is the number of discharges. So their discharges are higher initially. And later your inspiratory augmenting starts acting. So slight discharge here and there, but inspiratory augmenting mainly happens when ramping is happening. The majority of the impulses happen over here. It does carry out here, and a bit of expiration also it is carried. But number of discharges are much lesser, far less. So that is your inspiratory augmenting that acts. And later, towards the end of inspiration, your late inspiratory starts acting. This is when these neurons act. So because of the discharge of these neurons, what is going to happen finally? So because of the discharge of these neurons, finally what happens is the inspiratory activity. So let's take the muscular activity. Inspiratory muscles. So initially the abductors start acting, then abductors of the larynx, then followed by the activity of diaphragm. So they act. And if it stops here, means only diaphragm is acting. But if you want more prolonged inspiration, more ramping, more activity is recruited, and more muscles keep adding up like that. So the activity of these muscles keep increasing like that, and after inspiration it decreases. So these are the inspiratory muscles which are acting, and they're getting more recruited later. Now when expiration starts, expiration is a passive process, so there is no muscular activity. So when you talk about expiration, there are two sets of activities which are there. So this initial part is usually termed the E1 part, and this is E2. So expiration is divided into two parts. Inspiration is there, and expiration is usually divided into two phases. One phase is usually completely passive. And at that time, I had mentioned earlier when I was talking about mechanics of respiration, how the adductors act at this point to prevent foreign body entry. So that is when your expiratory recommencing acts. So they act. So they are the only ones that act. So at that point, your adductors are acting. So these muscles that act now are your adductors that act, and slowly they start declining later. So your adductor muscles start acting. So this is a much more gradual process. This a sudden action of adductors acting, and then it slowly wanes off. And this is when it is passive expiration. Now, after that, you need more active expiration. When that is needed, that is when your other muscles come into play. So your expiratory augmenting will start acting. They will act towards the phase 2. So the activity is much more. So because of this activity, and towards the end you have the late expiratory or pre-inspiratory. So they also act towards the end. So because of them, your expiratory muscles now come into picture. So they start acting and they start declining later. So these are the muscles that act. So this is the inspiratory muscles and the adductors. This is the abductor, and this is the adductor, and here the expiratory muscles are acting. So this is finally what happens because of these set of neurons, and results in respiration as we know it. So relate this to the mechanics of respiration I had taught you earlier, and it comes in a flow. Everything comes in a flow. And it is also said that the exact mechanism of how the pacemaker activity is continuously generating is still unclear, but what they say is that there's a calcium mediated activity. So the calcium channels are opened up in the iaxel, which recruit more iaxels, and they keep activating. And after that, later at this part, calcium induced potassium channel activation is there. That results in repolarization, and then when calcium falls again, the calcium channels get activated, and things like that happen. So basically the exact mechanism is not clear, but they do mention a role or a possible role of calcium channels and the potassium channels, and the calcium mediated activation of the potassium channel for the depolarization and repolarization curves that happen. So this whole thing is controlled by many other factors. So this central pattern generator. So these group of neurons are called the central pattern generators. These central pattern generators are in turn controlled by various factors that determine how much of expiration, inspiration, and all that should happen. It controls how much it should ramp, how fast it should progress, when expiration should stop, whether more recruitment of expiratory muscles should be there, more recruitment of inspiratory muscles should be there. So all these activation and inactivation are controlled by lot of factors. That is why later in the next 2 episodes we are going to deal with your neural regulation and chemical regulation. So over there we'll try to take all these things, use this base that you understood now when you study those 2 topics. So when I explain that, I'll be referring to basic things that you understood over here. So one thing is neural regulation. So we have the central pattern generator, all these neurons over here. Apart from that, on top you have the pons. There are pontine centers. So these pontine centers control the central pattern generators. What they do is they control this switch off point. They can prolong it or reduce it, and depending on that, the inspiration expiration can be adjusted. So pontine centers affect like that. Now you know that your chemoreceptors, peripheral chemoreceptors as well as central chemoreceptors, affect the rate of respiration. So they affect the rate and depth of respiration, and that is through activation of the central pattern generators. So we have the central chemoreceptors which control these respiratory neurons. We have the peripheral chemoreceptors which again control this. Now apart from that, you got the vagus. So Herring-Brewer reflex, you inspire, lung stretch reflexes are present. So that stops this. So when this is going too long, the volume is filled more than 1.5 liter, your body kind of gives a feedback through your vagus and telling it to stop it there. So that also acts over here, the stretch receptors. And then also we got the proprioceptors which are present. So proprioception. So even before you start exercising, when you start just stretching your muscles and all that basic things, your respiratory rate also starts increasing in response to an anticipation of some exercise. So that is also there. So whether you're feeling sleepy and you're lying down, that proprioceptors activates a lot of things, not only this. Cognition level is improved, a lot of things happen, blood flow is increased. So that is proprioception. So apart from this, there's something else. You might have learned about how things like morphine, opioids result in respiratory depression. So they have activation through the mu receptors can affect the central pattern generators and result in respiratory depression. So that is how by opioids you usually have a respiratory depression that you see. So these components are what we'll be dealing with in the next 2 episodes, the neural and the chemical regulation of respiration. So that is it about the central pattern generators. Now I know this is not important for the exam. Few points about this might come in different MCQs, but I feel that this is a very basic concept. If understood properly, can help you out a lot. It's not that difficult. And gaining knowledge is never a bad thing, especially in our profession. So see if you can understand this. If you can't, read it again. Try to understand this and it is going to help you out in the future. So thank you. If you found the channel to be useful, please do subscribe to it, drop a like, and you can clarify your doubts with me on my Instagram page. I put the link in my profile. And yes, thank you.